Okay, I think we're going to kick off. So welcome everyone to CSI Skill Tree. In this series, we take a close look at video games to examine and celebrate the work they do in envisioning the future and building rich, thought-provoking worlds. My name is Joey Eshrick. I work at the Center for Science and the Imagination at Arizona State University, and I'll be your host today. And the game we're going to be talking about in this episode is Cloud Gardens, which is a strangely soothing gardening game about using plants to overgrow and transform abandoned post-industrial landscapes. And I'm going to start off actually with this one by screen sharing a minute or two of gameplay footage right up top so you can get a sense of the game's unique visual style and hear its amazing music and sound design. Okay, so now that we've seen a very little bit, and you'll see some more of the game later, to tell you a bit more about the game, and then I will shift to introducing my collaborators and special guests for this event. So Cloud Gardens was released in 2020, and it was updated and expanded through the fall of 2021. In September, I believe the developer did like a major expansion and update, and the game was kind of more or less finished at that point. It was developed by Noio Games, which is a small studio led by Thomas Vandenberg. The game features sound and music by Amos Roddy, who also did the music for an earlier title we covered in this Skill Tree series, In Other Waters. It also features level design by Elijah Cawley and additional art by Fran Reck. And the game was really well received by critics and has been a bit of a sort of critical and reception phenom. And it's available for Mac, PC, and on Xbox consoles. So hopefully you'll be able to play it if this conversation gets you interested. Cloud Gardens explores environmental themes in a cryptic and quietly complex way. And that's exactly why we chose it for this series. It refuses end-of-the-world catastrophism, and it raises questions about the boundaries that we always construct between the organic and the built, the human and the non-human, the sublime and the dystopian. And so Orion Magazine is the perfect partner to help us design and present this episode of CSI Skill Tree. This is our first co-presented episode, and I'm so excited to be working with Orion on it. So Orion is an ad-free quarterly print publication that has been working at the convergence of ecology, art, and social justice for 40 years. And I can say personally, I've been a huge fan of Orion's executive director, Amy Brady, for years. Among other things, she's one of the world's most adroit thinkers and critics on literature and art about environmental change and the climate crisis. And so I'm very honored to invite Amy to share some brief thoughts. And thank you so much, Amy, for being here today.
Oh, Joey, thank you so much for such a kind introduction. It's such a pleasure to be here. And my colleague Zed O'Brien and I are absolutely thrilled to be partnering with you and ASU's Center for Science and the Imagination on this event. And we couldn't feel luckier to have Liz and Ken, who's also a contributor to Orion Magazine, joining us today. So, for those of you who are attending this event and may not be familiar with Orion, allow me to just say a little bit about what we are to expand on Joey's lovely introduction. We are a print magazine that's been publishing for 40 years, and in that time have published some of the best in environmental writing and art that helps us to think more expansively and complexly about humanity's relationship with the planet, to art and culture, and of course to each other. And so the chance to partner on an event that's exploring those types of themes in a video game just seemed exactly like the type of discourse that we wanted to be a part of. So thank you so much for that. So with that, let me just say again how pleased I am to be a part of this event and with such incredible thinkers. And Joey, I'm going to turn it back to you. Thanks again.
Thank you so much, Amy. So we will share that link again at the end of the event, but you can see it in chat for now for everyone. And so I've waited too long to introduce our special guests, our panelists, but I'm going to do that now. So I'm so delighted to be joined today by two people who will help us, I think, understand what makes Cloud Gardens such a challenging and absorbing meditation on humans in our natural world. First, I'd like to welcome Ken Liu, an author of science fiction and fantasy. And hi, Ken.
Thank you, Joey.
Yeah, you're welcome. His books include The Dandelion Dynasty, a silk punk epic fantasy series, and Paper Menagerie and Other Stories, a stunning short story collection. And in addition to writing, Ken speaks regularly at conferences and universities on a dizzying array of topics ranging from futurism and bookmaking to the history of technology and the mathematics of origami. And also, I'm very excited to welcome back Liz Fiacco, who is our first return CSI Skill Tree guest and kind of the honorary co-founder of this series. Liz really helped me sort of shape up ideas for what roles this series might play and the kinds of folks that we might include very early on. So thank you, Liz. Liz is an independent video game designer who has worked on a number of major commercial games you may have played, including Kena, Bridge of Spirits, which is pretty new, The Last of Us 2, Uncharted 4, and Pillars of Eternity. She's insightful about a huge variety of topics, including interactive narrative and how game mechanics can help to build emotional connections. So we're going to start. Oh, yeah, thanks. And give you two a chance to talk. Trying to charge through so we can start talking about the game. So we're going to, just to give you a sort of map for the event, we're going to start by introducing Cloud Gardens in more detail, and we're going to focus on the experience of play first, how the game finesses ideas of progress and growth, and the creative ingenuity that goes into making a game like this, which invites the player into a unique mode of interaction and contemplation. It's not necessarily what you expect when you hear video game. And while we're doing that, we're going to run more gameplay in the background, but we're going to do it quietly so y'all can focus on what Ken and Liz have to say. But hopefully that'll give you more of a sense of the game, its look, and a hint of some of the kind of mechanics and features that we're going to be talking about. And so Ken and Liz, thank you so much for joining us once again. And without further ado, let's get underway after I sort of messily go through the process of sharing my screen again. So give me one moment for that. Ken and Liz, you can see the gameplay video.
Yeah, we can.
Excellent. All right. So Ken, I'd like to start with you if I can and saddle you with this responsibility, which is, can you very briefly talk us through the experience of playing Cloud Gardens? How did it impress upon you? What are you doing? What are you doing as you play this game, and sort of how does it unfold?
Yeah. Thank you, Joey and Amy, for having me, and thank you, Liz. Looking forward to the conversation. So I found Cloud Garden both cryptic, as you said, and also strangely inviting. And when you start the game, you're presented with this post-industrial landscape, some sort of ruin wreckage where humans are no longer there. So it might be an abandoned parking lot or a broken highway entrance ramp or something like that. And you poke around it until you find a seed. And that's when the gameplay actually starts. You plant the seed somewhere in that landscape, and then you're given a bunch of objects. Might be a wrecked car, might be some abandoned old computer monitors, some traffic cones, things that are left behind when humans are not around. And then it is your job to place these objects in that landscape. You can place them any way you want, but the ultimate goal is as you place these objects, you realize that they actually generate some sort of energy or nutrient or something that causes that seed you planted earlier to grow. And when you have enough of these objects added, the plants will flower and bear fruit and allow you to get more seeds and plant them around the landscape. So the cycle continues with you being given more objects to place to encourage the growth of the plants. But you're supposed to fill the landscape with a harmonious arrangement of plants and of course the human objects that you use to encourage their growth in the first place. By the time with each scenario, your goal is to get to the point where the coverage of plant life in the landscape is sufficient for you to advance to the next stage. And of course, it's a puzzle game. So if you don't use your objects wisely and you don't get to the point where the plants provide enough coverage, then you have to start the level again. So that's kind of the mechanic. You're there to place these objects, get the plants to grow, to start the cycle, and you need to get the plants to fill the landscape sufficiently before you run out of objects. That's it in a nutshell.
So, Liz, do you want to expand on that or sort of add your own experience or anything that really jumps out at you with respect to how the game works, some of the key things that you're doing?
Yeah, I think what makes Cloud Gardens unique opposed to like a farming style of games where you might be like growing plants is there's really a focus on analog placement. Like you can really drop objects anywhere and you don't have a very fine control of where stuff goes. Objects become physicalized once you drop them, so they have a tendency to like tumble off of like where like what ledges that you want to put them on and stuff, so you kind of have to like accept these sort of like mistakes and surprises as kind of like part of the level. And it also just becomes part of the aesthetic of like sort of like final design of like where you've placed all of the objects and where you've placed all of your plants to have stuff that is just kind of a little bit haphazard, a little bit accidental. It doesn't you also don't have control over exactly where the plants grow either. So it's definitely a game that promotes this sort of kind of like overgrowth aesthetic as opposed to like a very manicured kind of styled garden like a Animal Crossing or something like that, where you have very fine control.
Yeah, I was reading an essay about Animal Crossing actually not so long ago, and it was a personal essay about playing that game during the pandemic. And this person and their partner had like designed these graph paper grids to like lay out the way that they wanted to do their gardens. And you know, this was something that was like really absorbing for them when they were like in lockdown and didn't have a lot of other creative outlets. But it really does strike you that this game doesn't have that grid, and therefore you don't have that ability to plan. And to the extent that you're trying to, manicure the space or aestheticize it, it's not about it necessarily imposing order. You have to sort of embrace that it's going to be a bit chaotic. And, it's sort of finding beauty, not in like a kind of really super planned out, like, Gardens of Versailles kind of aesthetic, but in a more kind of lush, wild, overgrown look and feel.
Yeah, absolutely.
So to expand on kind of where this sits within games and within kind of gardening and landscape games, Liz, you've called this a reverse development game. So this is maybe unlike empire building games or city building games like SimCity or the Civilization series, or in role-playing games where you're in control of an ever more powerful character who's sort of like riding a power curve towards omnipotence. Cloud Gardens isn't about linear notions of growth. It's not about economic expansion. And yet it has this kind of like board aesthetic where you're moving these dioramas around and positioning things. And so as a game designer, like what kind of challenges does that present? And how do you feel like the developers of this game have dealt with those challenges?
Yeah, it's definitely a challenging prospect to kind of step away from this idea of like exponential growth in games, because it is something that I think, because we're kind of in that system in real life, it's something that we gravitate to in game mechanics to build around. Just aesthetically, the game is built so much around like the promotion of sort of like natural life coming through. Like your object of progression is to, like Ken said, to like fill the space with like as much lush foliage as you can. Like there's a certain percentage of a threshold you need to meet.
Mm-hmm.
But the way they go about that is you kind of have to balance adding human elements and this sort of like garbage stuff with also the plants that you're trying to grow. So yeah, they did an interesting, yeah, aesthetically it ended up extremely interesting. And then I think also building it as like a puzzle game as opposed to like a large expansion kind of game allows you to kind of like make these like individual spaces without those. Then you can kind of start with a blank slate on the next one as well, and kind of like see how it unfolds from there too. So it's not like you've got like progression that carries through each puzzle.
Yeah, you're sort of not on the side of the plants, even though you're the one placing them, because you're also sort of the game, I think it really refuses a opposition that you might feel between like the detritus and trash and the plants. It's not a versus game. You're actually placing both and they interlock with each other.
Yeah, they're both extremely necessary. And just aesthetically, like many games where you're like doing city building or something like that, it's about kind of taking a wild space and kind of imposing order on it. So like harvesting resources and like building spaces like for yourself, for your needs. And this game kind of like is the opposite in the sense of like it kind of pushes you to like into like kind of take away the order. Like it's a clean slate and you're supposed to kind of like fill it with all these little kind of like happy accidents and stuff, and embracing like kind of the unpredictability of the plants and the placement of objects.
So can I have another question to direct your way, but do you want to kind of add to or respond to anything that Liz put on the table there?
Yeah, I think it's really interesting how when you play the game, it's a very meditative experience. You know, as Liz was mentioning, a lot of the joy of the game comes from just sort of let randomness play a little role and just sort of go with how things turn out. I do find it very interesting that the game from its very beginning invites you to tell a story. And I think a lot of these gardening placement games are like that, in that they're not so much games that tell a story as games that invite you to tell the story with it. So one of the things that I found myself doing when I was playing this is, after a while, the idea of going towards the goal of just going as fast as possible towards the next stage was no longer interesting to me, and I think that's by design. I don't think it's a game that tries to encourage you to rack up high scores or try to go for achievements and whatnot. I think the whole point of it is, yes, there's a little bit of a progression there just so you know what to do, but the real point is as you place these objects, can you tell a story and try to figure out what happened here? And you're invited to do that. You're given this parking lot and some garden gnomes and some computer monitors. So I found myself starting to imagine who were the people who lived here, who were the people who abandoned these things here, and what were they doing before they left? Why are these monitors arranged in this circle? Well, I put them there, but I like the way it looked, and I like to imagine that they were having a LAN party before something went wrong. I enjoyed putting the traffic cones where I did, thinking that, well, the owner of that trailer probably wanted to keep people off. And so after a while, you start to construct this story, and you start to invest yourself in that landscape, and it becomes not just a puzzle stage. It becomes the place where people whose stories you care about took place. I started to imagine these post-apocalyptic kind of tales about who were the people who survived in this landscape, and what were they doing. And of course, it doesn't wear its welcome out. It just, at some point, the stage is over, and you're shuttled onto the next stage where there's a blank canvas. You get to do this all over again. It ends up becoming a very meditative experience. It's very relaxing, which is really cool in a game. It just doesn't fill you with this dread that you're not accomplishing some sort of goal. It's anti-productive. As Liz points out, it's very much not about extracting resources. It's very much not about taking things out and exchanging them for some higher value. It's really about putting things down, putting yourself into it, and then just be happy with the fact that you put something down and you made something very ephemeral, but also very meaningful to you. And in that moment, after that experience is over, it's over. You have it. It's really not about taking anything out, and about feeling like you are trying to strive towards a goal. I really like that.
Yeah, for me, it kind of, the more I've played with this game in preparation for this conversation, the more it feels like finger painting or playing with an Etch-a-Sketch than it does playing some great gardening video games that are out there that it might be likened to. Like we've referred to Animal Crossing several times, or there's like the Harvest Moon series or Stardew Valley, which are often kind of talked about. This is just me, but they've often been talked about and sold to me by other folks who are fans as like really relaxing games. But like, I feel like because all of them at some level are asking you to kind of make an engine and harvest crops and optimize, there's always this like kind of idea that you're trying to achieve efficiency in some way, unlocking new gardening tools or watering things and rotating crops. And it's all good, but like to me, that feels like, more work, even if it's
work, yes.
Beautiful pixel art and music. This doesn't have that. Like you're saying, it has this ephemerality of like, you're getting a clean board and you're getting to construct stories. And as Liz shared earlier, that there is some randomness and play to how you drop things. So it's like you sort of can't be efficient. And the whole aesthetic is kind of militates. You can see the screen filling up with flotsam and jetsam. Like it sort of militates against a sort of cleanly efficient machine type approach. It's so different than so many games that I think want to be relaxing and create that kind of mood.
The story mode as well too just gives you such a limited palette as well. Like they only give you a handful of like human-made objects at a time to pick from. So you have some choice in like how you want to place stuff down, and you only have a handful of seeds. Like you never get like a vast array of seeds, which I think kind of helps with that kind of like analysis paralysis problem of like trying to optimize and find the perfect solution, because like you only have a limited number of like puzzle pieces at any one time. So like you can't sit there pondering like which of like the 3 cars you're going to place down first.
So one thing I wanted to, in terms of a sort of game design jargon, one thing I wanted to kind of throw into the mix here without doing it too much is to ask one of you, could be you, Liz, maybe, to talk a little bit about environmental storytelling, which is kind of building on what Ken was saying about constructing stories, but that is a kind of like game design terminology, and I think it might be helpful to introduce in this conversation to frame out what the game's up to. Could one of you take a swing at that?
Sure. Yeah. So environmental storytelling usually in video games means like setting up a space so the details of that space imply a certain backstory to it. And it can be anything as like on the nose as like, like zombies inside spray painted to like a door, or it can be a lot more subtle, like just walking into a living room and like seeing like a bunch of unread magazines or something out on the coffee table. It implies something about the people who use that space and like the history of that space and like the time scale that space kind of exists in. So it's used a lot in video games because like a vast majority of video games you're exploring physical spaces, and that is a very interactive way to kind of understand like what happened there without needing to kind of like stop the game and like explain it to you.
Yeah.
So in video games generally, like ones that have kind of a pre-made narrative, so like working on like The Last of Us, we would decide essentially the history of certain spaces and decorate them appropriately so the player could understand maybe like what they need to, or even if it's just for flavor, like to kind of give it some personality. And then what Ken was getting at with this game is it really puts that back in the player's hands. So they give you kind of this, like I was saying, like a limited palette to work with. And then it's sort of up to the player to sort of decide like the significance of each one of those objects as they place them down. So you can throw them down randomly if you'd like, but because the game is so meditative and because it asks you to be like a little bit more thoughtful with your placement, just from a mechanical perspective, it also kind of invites you to start thinking about like, okay, like it's a briefcase, like what did they use it for? Like were they traveling like across the continent or something like that? And sort of like lets you make your own environmental storytelling within the space. They usually give you a little bit of a prompt too, because we say like a blank slate at the beginning, but they do give you like a little bit of like, oh, here's like a couple of lawn chairs, like, and one concrete block, and like immediately you can start kind of seeing how you want to start filling out the scene.
Right.
Yeah.
Can anything to add about environmental
I
storytelling? Yeah.
Yeah, I was just gonna say that's a great example, Liz, you put out there, because I remember seeing that, and I got these beer cans, so right away I put them right on there. This is where they were having their little party, and who knows what they were thinking about? Maybe it was the last day before the end of the world, or maybe it could be as innocuous as just they decided to stop here for one day. Um, I also found it really interesting that in terms of the environmental storytelling, they were very careful about not coming out and saying too much. So, for example, I think I mentioned this to Joey at some point. None of the signage is written in readable language. There's just it's done in a way low resolution enough that you can sort of see their traffic signs or road signs, but you can't really tell what's being written down there. And I think that's really lovely. There's a way in which modern life is so filled with the idea of reading that we tend to read everything. Everything has become a signifier of some sort, and we are no longer able to just be placed in a scene and then try to see it as anything other than a page to be read, to have meaning extracted out of it. But again, this is not a game that's about extraction. It's not a game about figure out what information was supposedly encoded here and take it away. It actively resists that approach, and so you're again, as I said, not reading, but rather you are writing, if you are, or you're invited to collaborate with the space. You put the things in there and you put your own meaning into it. And whether someone else will even read the same story out of this as you is an open question, but it doesn't really matter. You're here not to extract meaning. You're here to simply put objects in place and imply a story for yourself. find that very interesting, beautiful, and moving.
The mechanics, yeah, they also kind of enable you to like co-author as well, because there's this sense of like, okay, in your head you're like, oh, a beer can, I'm going to put it next to these like lawn chairs, this is where they have the party, and then like immediately the beer can like falls off the edge of the ledge that they're on, and then like is now like tumbled down, and like then that becomes part of the story of like they set down their beer can and it tumbled off the edge, and the game kind of like physicalized mechanics sort of co-authors that with you. And then additionally, with the way the plants work is like you might be able to say like, okay, I plant the seed here, but then like time and nature is like kind of what takes over of like the direction of the growth of the plant, and like where they bear fruit, and the ultimate look of the space when it's completely overgrown, which is pretty cool.
So I want to actually key in, this is a great transition you've provided me, Liz, to the game as a kind of environmentalist text or ecological text, maybe. And one thing we've talked about that I want to delve into is how it challenges preconceptions about environmental stories, and how Cloud Gardens helps us think about, in different ways, the role of human presence in the environment, the role of human agency in shaping our environments, our responsibilities and duties to the places that we are. And also, I want to prompt you to say, what does the game have to say about this notion of untouched natural purity that we encounter so much in our environmentalist and ecological thinking? So what does the game make of that? That's a typical Joey question. What's the game make of that huge knot of sort of messy issues?
Well, I mean, if I can start, I don't think the game, I think the game does this really interesting thing where it sort of throws the question back in your face, right? And sort of forces you to contend with it yourself. I mean, as I mentioned earlier, I think there's something really interesting about the idea that you encourage the growth of these seeds by placing human objects next to them. That's what energizes, and that's what allows them to grow. We speak so much about nature these days in terms of cleaning it up or removing ourselves from it. Much of the environmental discourse that we engage in seems to be about removing the human from nature, and that obviously sets up an opposition between what is human and what is nature, which we all sense deep down is not quite right. We don't really want to think that way, and yet we seem to be unable to escape that kind of discourse. And when we see human objects in nature, our instinct, or we've been trained by our discourse to view it as negative, as a bad thing. So a lot of our talk about environmentalism is about restoration. But what does restoration mean? It seems to suggest that we're supposed to make it so that humans are no longer there. Can that really be what we mean? I'm not sure that really is what we mean. So this game takes all of those questions and says, look, it's complicated. This is a world in which one of the tools you have is this chainsaw, and you're going to have to figure out when you want to cut down the wild growth and place some more human objects into it. You're going to have to figure out how you feel about the fact that the way to make this plant grow and bloom is by putting a stack of tires next to it. How do you feel about that? And I have to say, it's very ambivalent and not, it doesn't come out with a specific message at all. And so you are invited to really think about this, because the bottom line is, if humans were gone tomorrow from this planet, this is exactly what would happen. Nature would not somehow be restored. It would simply grow into the spaces where humans are now, and you would end up with a landscape pretty much like that, where the human and the quote unquote natural are mixed together. And we are forced to, I think, rethink what it means to have nature, what it means to be part of it, what it means to have these extracted objects being a part of the landscape, because we're, all the objects we make, they're not going away. They're there. And we need to think about what it means to have them be part of nature. So I think it's a really challenging, thoughtful response to a question that we don't often have the opportunity to think about and talk about in depth, which is, why do we think about nature as opposed to human agency, and how do we rethink this whole thing so that we don't think of ourselves as in opposition to it, no matter how well intentioned. That's just not going to get us where we need to be.
Yeah, it's interesting because I feel like the aesthetic interplay between the sort of like human leftovers and these like remains, kind of like trash, and the natural is kind of what drew me to this game in the first place. It's like why I played it initially, like when it came out. Partially because like I just moved to Pittsburgh, and I was really interested in this sort of like post-industrial aesthetic where a lot of these like old sort of like factory buildings and stuff like that were like no longer in use, and they were starting to get overgrown, and then they kind of become reused by humans like in another way, or old stuff was getting adapted to like be more green, in like a very yeah, it's like this sort of like collaborations between like humans and nature. And I think that like kind of baton exchange is very interesting to me. The sort of like humans develop something, nature kind of like takes it back, and then humans can come develop it again and like kind of like craft it. And yeah, that sort of like co-authored space is very interesting to me. Just from like an aesthetic perspective, and then yeah, I think too, just like that then extends to kind of like a philosophical perspective, because it's true, like you don't want to just like fold humanity out of the picture forever. We have to find a way to like coexist, like accept the fact that we're part of the natural world. We are animals that exist in space with meat suits, so like we have to yeah, like kind of coexist like with the stuff that we make and we need, with like kind of the unpredictability of nature.
Yeah, it strikes me, you know, talking to the two of you and getting my head around this game, it has made me appreciate even more like what a neat trick these mechanics pull off, because other games that are kind of about remediation, rebuilding, you know, the sort of post-apocalypse, you know, if that's what you decide is going on in this, it's not terribly clear, as we've been talking about, are often they have a moral valence to them, even if they sort of don't mean to. They're like, we're cleaning things up. We're like busting out the concrete and like letting the roots grow again. You know, it's a real privilege of kind of, again, like privileging like untouched environments. And, you know, that cuts against a bunch of, you know, sort of politically urgent things, recognizing, for example, how indigenous tribes all over the world are active stewards of their natural ecosystems and surrounding environments, and that they in fact are, you know, safeguarding in a world of, you know, incredible environmental collapse, a huge amount of biodiversity. And, you know, that narrative about withdrawing and, you know, making things untouched, and that sort of, I don't know, maybe like Emersonian impulse can be destructive and sort of profoundly anti-humanistic, and again, moralistic, and in a way that like, you know, I think this game takes advantage of the fact that it's experiential, that it's not just narratological. It's not just sort of telling you a story about a person making a choice or doing something. It's I think one of you earlier in one of our preparatory conversations called it our sort of archaeological experience, that it was about, you know, sort of uncovering a history and imagining a trajectory, but one where you don't have to pretend that we haven't, you know, recklessly overdeveloped the planet. You know, we, you know, like we're going to have to learn to live in those ruins and find beauty in them. And that's something that you see not only in these indigenous movements that emphasize the active human role in stewarding the environment, but also in things like backyard ecology, trying to find the beauty in the ways that like the enmeshments of the organic and the human, and that we're going to have to find ways to value nature in that form, because most of us don't get to experience the sort of untrammeled, beautiful, pristine environments. And to the extent that those exist, if you go to a national park in the US, I mean, those are very actively managed. They're sort of stage managed to look pristine, but they're not actually nearly as pristine as they look. So I don't know. I think that, you know, the game does a nice job of like entangling you in all those issues instead of giving you a position of moral clarity to look down on them from.
I really also like the fact that the game's mechanics make you sort of experience something that I think is increasingly rare in modern life, or at least in the way we talk about it, which is the idea that being human can also mean being not in control and letting things happen. A lot of our discourse is very focused on the idea of human agency being a kind of shaping, directed, goal-oriented force, that human agency has to be, we design a city, we build a city, we are going to remove the wilderness and we're going to impose our will on it. But that's not the only way to be human. In fact, it's not the majority of how most of the world's population in history have experienced being human. A lot of it is about throwing some seeds out and then see what happens. A lot of it is about walking the way we want to walk and see over time what develops. Here you are placing objects, and like Liz was mentioning, the mechanics are such that you don't have total control. Things will happen and you're going to be surprised by it. And you'll be like, okay, that's kind of interesting. I'm not in control. I wanted that sign to stay up, but it toppled over. That's all right. I'll just live with it and I'll do my thing following that. It's really nice about forcing you, or maybe that's not the best word, but it's really good about encouraging you to accept, to be more Taoist about the way life is, and to say, this is the flow of the universe and I'm part of it. I will flow with it.
It definitely feels like it rewards you for that as well, because I don't think I've ever like played a level in Cloud Gardens and then at the end of the level felt like dissatisfied with like how it looks aesthetically. Like when by the time you get to the end of it, it looks beautiful, kind of like no matter what happens. So like I think it does kind of encourage you to sort of embrace like the unpredictability of it and like find the beauty in it.
Liz and Ken, I wanted to kind of open a space toward the end of our sort of conversation here to try to wrap in some of the concerns that we've been talking about with kind of the emotive aspects and again aesthetic aspects of the game. So this game has this mix of kind of what I think of as a sort of bipolar, like really precise but also really fuzzy art. It's called, I had to look it up, it's called voxel art. It's not pixel because it's in 3 dimensions as far as I can understand. It has this very aggressively fluorescent color palette. It looks quite different than other depictions of, quote, the end of the world or the post-industrial, but also other games. It's sort of part of a turn towards a more colorful palettes, I think, in games recently. And then the music and these like, which we only heard for a minute here, so everyone, I apologize, but the really like finely tuned sound effects that are really like crunchy and satisfying, like that really rewards you at a basic level for placing things and interacting. So yeah, I'd like to hear from you two as creators, as a level designer for games, and Ken as a storyteller and author and editor. Like, what is the sort of vibe and the kind of the affect of the game do for you? What was it like to play it? What kind of mode and state did it put you in? And then how does that kind of like support all of the other kind of big ideas and heady notions we've been talking about?
Well, I'll go. I'm not a game designer, so I can't speak to the technical aspects in great detail, but I can speak to the way it tries to open up a space for you to tell your own story. I've long had this theory about fiction, which is that fiction, especially the great classics, are very successful precisely because they leave a lot of space for readers to tell their own stories. It's actually a mistake to think of literature as about telling the story as a communicative act, which it is not. The way literature works often is that the creator sets up a space, that there is a story in it that the creator wishes to tell. But the story that the reader ends up taking away is often not the same story at all. The reader, in order to unpack the text, has to sort of pack it first with her own life experience, with her own understanding of human nature, with her own agenda and desire for how the world ought to be. And so the best stories are stories that encourage fan fiction, if you will. They encourage the reader to play within that space and to fill it and tell their own stories. And I found the aesthetic in Cloud Gardens to be very much in line with my own theory of fiction. It is very much about letting you figure out what the story ought to be and to tell your own story within it, to be playful about the story you wish to construct. The aesthetic of the game and the tools given to you are very much key towards that. You don't have the kind of precise control that a lot of games give you because you're not encouraged to be precise. You're not encouraged to be super in control. It's not a game that encourages your own control freak tendencies and your OCD tendencies, which I have a lot of. But the game's aesthetic is very good about moving away from that and saying, look, things are bulky. This is kind of like Minecraft, except it's anti-Minecraft because it's not about a grid. It's not about putting things in exactly where you want them to be. It's telling you to take the longer view, the bigger view, to sort of step back and say, I can't do what I want to do with the kind of precision that I'm encouraged to take with my job. So I'm not going to do that. Rather than planning out everything down to the pixel, I will just approximate. I will just put things down and see what happens. I will just let it flow. The more relaxed you are about this, the more fun you actually will have. And I really love that. I really love the fact that it tries to open up the spaces as much as possible so that you can tell your own story. But it does try to give you nudges such that you're trying to tell stories of fulfillment, of satisfaction, of going with the flow, rather than stories of conflict, of failure, of striving but failing. And that's lovely. It's a difficult thing to do, to create a space that encourages a certain kind of story that leaves you in a happy emotional space, but discourages the stories that make you frustrated. I mean, some games obviously have their aesthetic making the player frustrated, but this is not one of them, and I really love that.
Yeah, I think both like aesthetically and mechanically, it feels like it's trying to keep you in the present. So like the sort of like poppy sound effects and stuff is something that it's like it's very reactive to like what you've like just done. So it sort of like feels like the space is alive. They do like restrict like information from you, like only giving you kind of like a small number of like objects to use at any one time. So you can't be forward thinking in like a huge way. You can't think like 12 moves ahead. So it does kind of like force you to think just like in the moment. And I think by doing that, they like really encourage this sort of like meditative flow state, because like you just kind of like take what you're given and like mess around with it there and make like every decision as like this sort of like small step. And each one of those steps is like satisfying in like a small way as part of like a broader picture. Like, yeah, even just being able to place something and see stuff grow a little bit and then place another thing and it grows a little bit more and you place a third thing and now it bears fruit and you're like, oh, cool. Like every time there's just like a little bit more to it. And yeah, I think that's where it's like relaxation comes from, because you're mentioning like something like Stardew Valley, where like I have the same experience where like early game, I find it quite relaxing. And then later game, I'm thinking about it outside of playing the game, of being like, oh my God, there's like items I need to get. And like, you're making all of these plans and it pulls you out of the moment to moment relaxation. And I've never had that problem with Cloud Gardens. So
Yeah.
Yeah.
So we have several interesting questions that kind of extend the conversation that we've been having. So I want to get to those and spend some time with them. So let's see. The first question is, so Liz, I think this is for you a little bit. How does the experience of playing this game compare to the development and design of a game like The Last of Us Part 2, which also features an overgrown post-industrial environment? So, I mean, yeah, like I would take that as like similarities and then differences, you know, but I do think these games do talk to each other in a super interesting way.
They do, and I do have a unique perspective of working on The Last of Us as opposed to just playing it, where like this was almost more similar to working on it, where you were deciding like how to place interesting stuff. I'm not a environment artist, so I wasn't the one like placing beer bottles and stuff unless they're interactable. But yeah, I think for me, it's kind of what Ken was getting at of like you're kind of cooking up a story, and like with Cloud Gardens, it feels like you're given a very distinct prompt and yeah, this like limited palette to like tell that story with. And then with The Last of Us, like coming up with environmental storytelling, it's a little bit more of a thorough job to be like, okay, like this is what it was like pre-apocalypse, and then what happened during the apocalypse, and then what happened yesterday, and then what it is today. But those kind of levels of like considering a history of a space and then how you can tell that story with like physical clues as opposed to explanations, I think is like very similar. And then, yeah, like I mentioned too, I was just drawn to this game aesthetically. As what drew me into working in on The Last of Us was like partially the aesthetics, the post-apocalyptic kind of beauty in the abandoned aesthetic as well. So that definitely had a lot of similarities for sure. And then Naughty Dog is full of perfectionists, so we do not just drop tires in and they roll wherever they go. We craft every little thing. So that's the major difference.
It does strike me that, you know, it lines up with what Ken was saying earlier and sort of creating a schema for like writing and reading, you know, that I think, you know, having played a lot of these like big open environment games that are lovingly designed, like you have different levels of immersion where you can like learn the lore and really master like the timeline. And like, you know, if you really follow all the breadcrumbs of the like, you know, whatever it is, computer terminals or audio logs or digging up messages in bottles or whatever. But here, you know, you're always making conjectures in Cloud Gardens. There aren't really any answers to uncover. And so it's a different relationship between the text and the user of the text, I guess.
Yeah, it's interesting because like there's also a very logistical purpose to avoiding the necessity of text in level design, even for something like in The Last of Us, where we might use text to sort of like flavor a space or something like that, but we do try to like avoid the necessity of it as like a information that the player has to have to understand the space, because you can't localize it if it's in like the environment. Like if it's like a board that like exists in space, that's very difficult to localize. Like
when you say localize, just for folks who don't play as many games,
to translate to like other languages and
to
stuff,
kind of culturally resituate the game for when it's being played in different cultures,
culturally,
and,
and also just like you know if someone playing Last of Us in France can't read a sign in English, like
right, may not be able to,
yeah. So yeah, trying to do as much storytelling as you can that is non-textual is very, very important.
Great. So to kind of alley-oop that question, somebody else asked, observed that a lot of big games from Last of Us series to Breath of the Wild to Kirby in recent titles, Fallout is a really obvious one, seem to really revel in these post-industrial environments. So like this person asks, what do you all make of that sort of trend in gaming? And I would say maybe in storytelling more broadly. I mean, that's a very big question, but I don't know if y'all have any thoughts. I'll just add, so while you're thinking about it, that for me, when we've worked on climate writing projects at our Center for Science and the Imagination, some of like Kim Stanley Robinson, who's an author we've had the honor of working with, he's an incredibly great author and thinker on these issues, has said that a lot of contemporary climate fiction has an elegiac quality, that it's about kind of like helping people process emotions of grief and mourning about something that's lost, even though like a lot of this stuff isn't lost yet. It's degrading or starting to fall apart. You're starting to see changes, or natural sort of cycles are starting to seem disrupted or less reliable. And that there's this sense that maybe even we're in the early stages, or almost prematurely or prospectively mourning things that are gone. And that, you know, perhaps playing these post-industrial environments and exploring them is a way of dealing with that. You know, I really see that in Breath of the Wild, where there's this really quietly sad quality to a lot of the environments and traversing them. And of course, in that game, you're like from the past, and so you're sort of like in this space where all of the stuff that you're familiar with and all the people that populated it are gone, and you're trying to like pick through the ruins. But I would love to hear what the two of you think.
Yeah, I mean, I think Joey and Liz, I think this is very much as a result of the meta narrative that we're trying to engage with in culture. I mean, the fact that we're so obsessed with post-apocalyptic stories and stories of nostalgia, of trying to recover a past that is no longer continuing into the future. I think that has a lot to do with the meta narrative we're engaged in society right now. While I'm very skeptical of all sorts of narratives about how we are so different from all ages in the past, I think it is undeniable that in some ways we are unique. I don't think at any time in history has so much information being available to everybody at the same time. And that amount of overwhelming information does give us pause. There is something incredibly strange about the living generations right now. I think we are experiencing and seeing proof of change in a way that in the past was difficult and not possible. We have photographs and videos and a lot of evidence right in front of our eyes of how we used to be, and we are different. The fact that our language evolved so much in 10 years that words that we used to use now sound utterly ridiculous is part of it. It's the sense that the things we used to have are gone and they're going away so fast is frightening, I think, to a lot of us. And so this is all part and parcel of our obsession with narratives about trying to understand how this could go on. And it doesn't help, of course, that there are real existential threats that we face as a society, whether it's in the environment or nuclear war or other things that can end our way of life at a moment's notice. We live in the shadow of these things constantly, and it's just not. It doesn't surprise me at all that they seep out into the stories we tell, even stories that are meant to relax us, to entertain us, to take us away. Even our escapism is driven by these anxieties. So it doesn't surprise me that these are the stories we obsess over and tell each other.
Yeah, I think too, like that. I think that's part of like what struck me about like traveling across the country and like moving to a new city and stuff like that too, is like in a lot of ways too, it's like a reflection of spaces that do exist currently right now, like not a potential future, but like truly it's like walking the dog, like seeing like an overgrown school, like with like stagnant water and like it looked like a Last of Us level. Like and I think we're trying to reckon with like reflecting those kind of spaces and like the way that they're kind of like creeping into kind of our environment, because a lot of those spaces are that way because they're in limbo. Like we don't know what to do with those yet. Like how do we adapt them? How do we move forward? Like where is the money for that coming from? What do we do with them? And I think I don't think that we have answers yet for that on the scale that we need to address them. So I think fiction's trying to take the first stabs at that, to be like, what do we do? Like, yeah.
So to take a bit of a turn, but to another great question, Martin asks, is the game giving us the opportunity to view the habitat or the environments from the point of view of other living things. And immediately what this made me think of is that, and you saw it in the clips that we watched, like there's crows or ravens often sort of flying around, but it does, Martin raises I think a really excellent question. I've been looking at this question and thinking about it, which is, like, what, if anything, is the point of view, and to what extent is a non-human point of view implied? You're of course playing the game as a human, and so there is a human point of view in the mix. But what do you all make of point of view, and then sort of other living things and their perspectives in the game?
Liz, you want to go first?
Yeah, I think, aesthetically they bring in like crows and stuff like that. I don't think they give them necessarily like a point of view. Like you don't get the sense of like the crow's desire for a certain outcome or something like that. But I think to that regard, my interpretation is like it kind of is a game that resists a lot of like extrinsic need anyway. So like you're not doing this necessarily like for you or for the birds or for like deer that crawl in or something like that. There's just kind of like a intrinsic, because it's beautiful now, kind of that's the satisfaction, at least I feel playing the game. I think that seems to be where I think their focus kind of lies.
Yeah, I mean, I think, given the way the game's interface is presented to you, obviously, naturally, your first reaction is you're in the role of, a godlike being, because you're in control of the environment and you're directing it. But as we mentioned, the actual experience sort of goes against that. You're not so much in control as you are just sort of co-evolving with the space. I do think that in a lot of ways, the game tries to take you outside of your very uniquely situated 21st century human perspective, because you are encouraged to view these objects not in the role that we normally associate them with, but as sources of growth for plants. And so even if you're trying to tell a human story with them, you are, I think, consciously or unconsciously also encouraged to rethink these objects as part of the landscape, as surfaces on which plants can grow, as obstacles or surface structures for the vines to cling to, and imagine, birds perching on them and insects crawling over them. You are, I think, in some way encouraged to take a more non-human perspective over the landscape, because these objects are truly taken away from their human associations and contextualized in this new space. So I find that interesting. This is a great question. I don't know if I have an answer, so much as just a lot of thoughts provoked by it, and I really like that.
So I want to close us out with two questions that address the same thing. We have just a couple minutes to talk about these, so I'll try to summarize them together. One is it sort of starts with the observation that the game creates Zen while the player becomes a force of nihilistic pollution and growth at the same time. Again, you're like, as we've talked about, you're placing human objects is an excellent turn of phrase from the person who asked this question. So what kind of thinking does that gameplay and environment convey? And then to go with that, Chris asks a longer question that I'll try to buzz through, which is, very, similarly about agency, that, the game is indeed complicating the human nature binary, but that you do have this 5-fingered glove that you use when you move your cursor around sometimes. And so there is this sort of way that the player is shaping these environments. It doesn't, Chris observes, play itself like the game Everything. It's still a garden. You have to do things to it to make things happen. And so perhaps this speaks to the enmeshed co-constitutive nature of the modern world, but does this reliance on player interaction undercut the agency of the natural world, or does it speak to the need to kind of think of human agency in relation to the natural world? This is a call to action. So Chris, thank you for the big question, which we could have talked about for the whole hour, but what do you all think about this sense of agency, and then this sense of like a a polarity at the heart of the game about polluting, but also growing.
If I can just respond
Please
to that
do.
a little bit, because this is something that I think about a lot, actually. I'm very influenced by a, a line of thinking that dates back to the early American transcendentalists, but that's much more commonly now expressed through the writings of writers like Annie Dillard, which is this radical skepticism about our traditional Western notions of human agency being opposed to nature, and that we actually know what nature really is. The very idea that we define certain things as poison and toxin to nature implies certain knowledge that we don't actually have. The reality is, whatever heavy metals we generate and the polymers that we produce and so on and so forth, if we just leave them in nature as they are, nature will evolve given enough time to consume it, to incorporate into part of their ecology. Nature will always find a way, to be flippant about it, to make us irrelevant. What to us is poison will be food to someone else. Nature will ultimately evolve some cycle that make our intervention irrelevant. So to say that something is poisonous is not really about nature so much as it is about us. It's poisonous to us as we are constituted now. It is harmful to us as we are constituted now. So let us not speak of these things as though we are really caring about nature, quote unquote, as it is a self-interested discussion
Right.
about making the environment suitable for us. So with that out of the way, I think a lot of the binary sort of goes out of the place. I think the game tries to make you take the perspective that don't think about things in this restorative, untouched, let's make nature the way it ought to be, because all of these things are human concepts. They have no place in nature. Nature is just as happy with an abandoned parking lot as it is with rich soil. It will figure some way out of using it. The fact that we appreciate one landscape more than the other has more to do with us and our own judgments than it does with nature. Nature is incredibly uncaring about our thoughts. That's just the fundamental truth. And I think the game really does try to get you to think about human agency as not a force to be imposed on nature, but simply one part of it. To be a little more new age about it, we say it's about harmony between human and nature, but I think it's more than that. It's really about the radical acceptance of human irrelevance. And in that irrelevance, we are actually in that moment of recognition of our own irrelevance is when we truly achieve our potential, because we are no longer standing outside of nature, but truly part of it. What we do, the acts that we commit, are acts of nature. And I think the game tries to, at least to me, direct me towards that.
Liz, any final thoughts before we wrap up?
Oh my goodness. Yeah,
Ken's
no,
a tough act to follow.
It is indeed. I guess like what struck me was like the word nihilism in like that question was yeah, I think that is also like a very like current human perspective when you can like see like if you see like an abandoned car or like an abandoned RV or something like that, and you're implying this like loss of like the people that live there, or like a community that existed and now no longer does. And I think that might be where that kind of like impulse is like coming from, because if you're looking at it from like an ecological standpoint, like the plants are thriving. Like
Yeah.
So I think like there's an interesting like push and pull between I don't think the game says like it's like because you're adding like these human components and stuff to the space, I don't think it's encouraging this idea that like we have to push humans out in order to let plants in. But I think that the sadness you might feel when struck with like this sort of like post-industrial landscape is, I think maybe like something nostalgic, like something you're kind of like clinging to, like this idea of like what was. And this game, I think, really has its eyes on like what could be, like what's the next steps, like where does this go from here? And it doesn't really linger in that nostalgic sort of state.
It does strike me from what both of you have said that, you know, it's like we so often talk about, you know, we need to save the planet, but what we're really talking about is like saving ourselves and
100%.
saving ways of life and conditions in which we can be comfortable in certain culturally defined ways.
Right.
But we often offload that onto the planet. And when, as Ken said, it's much more self-interested. All right. Well, so with we're leaving you with all that to think about, because we're gonna say farewell here. So thank you so much once again, Ken and Liz, for joining me today and for your insights and wisdom and sharing your thoughts. You can learn more about Ken and his work at kenleo.name, and you can follow him on Twitter at kyleo99. You can follow Liz on Twitter at Liz Fiacco. She doesn't have anything to hawk right now, but she has as yet unannounced game projects that you're going to want to check out. So keep an eye on Liz's online presence. And we're going to be hosting more Skill Tree conversations this year. And so to get notified about episodes, you can subscribe to our YouTube channel, which is youtube.com/imaginasu. And we're on Twitter at imaginationasu. And one more time, the heartiest thanks to Orion Magazine and to Amy Brady for making this event possible. And you can learn more about Orion and subscribe at orionmagazine.org. Very good magazine to keep under your coffee table for reading on the weekends and in between things. And you can follow Orion on Twitter at Orion_magazine. And finally, I need to thank my colleagues at the Center for Science and the Imagination at ASU, especially Aravind Hari Nair, who created our gameplay videos. And is going to edit this episode for us. So thank you so much for being here with us today. And Ken and Liz, I hope you have a great afternoon. Thanks for spending this time with us.
Thanks, Joey.
Thank you so much.